Level podcast. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. We really appreciate it. If this is your first time, I'm Thomas Baker and my co-host is Randy Shrewsberry. We're both former police officers who sort of apply a critical lens to issues related to the criminal justice system. We try to have an ongoing conversation on the podcast about the system and the reform that's taking place, and the people who are behind that change. So the activists, authors, practitioners, academics, and people who are subject to the system, people whose lives have been impacted by it, all with a focus on the problems that we're facing as a society, and then some of the things that we can maybe do to make things better for everyone. So on this episode, Randy and I, we're going to have a conversation about the lack of national standards for police officers in this country. There's just no sort of centralized system in place that dictates how police officers should be trained. We also talk about risks that police officers face that are very real, but where the training is not really in place to prepare them for those risks. So things like COVID-19, PTSD, suicide, and these other risks that they face that are very real, but they're not emphasized in training regimes. So if you find these podcasts useful, please, the best way to help us out is to like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment on whatever platform you're with. It's really organic word of mouth that helps us spread the podcast and share this information. And without anything further, sit back and enjoy. Hey, Randy. So it's been kind of, we're heading up to the end of January 2021, just to put people, give them an idea of, where we are in time right now. And we had a recent event in the Capitol back on January 6th, where I've heard a bunch of different words used to describe it: riot, insurrection. I don't know what the proper term for it is, but
terrorist attack.
Yeah, terror. Yeah, whatever. That's a whole other ball of wax we can get into, whether or not we want to start using that term and the power that comes with harnessing that. Especially when we built this amazing apparatus for fighting a global war on terrorism, to then turn that internally. That can be an interesting turn of events. But so I was watching these events, I guess shock, and well, I shouldn't say shock, in horror, like I think most everyone was, because I recognized that this is the U.S. Capitol. This is sort of, supposed to be the heart of our democracy, where the people's representatives come together and make decisions about our society and the big decisions and represent our interests. And these people stormed the Capitol, occupied it for a bit. We're going through people's desks, taking computers and equipment, and there's been sort of like a flood of information hitting in the media, where I've seen police departments around the country suspending officers, firing officers, investigating officers for being there, and then also accounts of an officer wearing a MAGA hat and directing people through the Capitol, and
taking selfies.
Taking selfies. What did you think the reason? Did you notice any sort of thing different about the response when compared to the response that we saw earlier this summer with the BLM protests?
Yeah, well, and I think what's interesting is that even as we started this conversation is that we're struggling even with the language of what to call this, right? And I agree with you. Even though I said terrorist, I don't know from a legal definition that's the right way to go.
Even if it is, I'm worried about where we go with it.
That's right. That's right. Well, and I think if we hold it to the same standards that we have relative to, brown folks, especially Muslim folks, then it was. So, this was a terrorist act, and, very similar to the suicide bombing in Nashville, a couple of weeks prior to that. I think that, the big question, right? That, and you and I, talked about this a little bit offline. Is that what was the incident itself? The response by the police, was it improper, or was it just different? And different it was, right? I mean, for sure. And I think that the hypocrisy, even though hypocrisy is not something that I generally, because I generally like to focus too much on, because we're all hypocrites in our own way. But the hypocrisy of, here is a situation where 5, now, maybe even 6 deaths directly related to this, 2 of which were police officers.
3, I would say 3. Well, there was the
3.
officer. Well, there was an officer who was killed from injuries. I think he was hit with a fire extinguisher.
Right. Yeah. And a pole. Yeah.
Right. And then an officer committed suicide. Yeah. Shortly afterwards. And then now, I think just a few days ago, another officer committed suicide.
Right. Right.
Think about that. 2 that were involved in that event, to have 2 people kill themselves is pretty incredible.
So, I mean, and I know that for probably most of the people, who are listening now, I mean, I think that we have a range of people with, different kind of political backgrounds, but, most reformists, I would say, the echo has been over and over and over is, could you imagine that this was BLM, or could you imagine that this was a Muslim group? So I think that I think it's quite obvious that there was a drastic different response than what we saw about, the protest around George Floyd's death over the summer, or even the continuation of the BLM movement. But that being said, is that I don't necessarily think that it was all the wrong approach. Some of it was. I don't know how it was that the DC police chief and others said that they weren't, they didn't see this coming.
I saw it coming just as a casual observer.
Yeah. I in fact, my old man joke was I should let them be on my Twitter account, with even my small group of following and followers, is that it seemed very clear that this was on the horizon. Now, their surge into the Capitol, I don't know.
No, I didn't expect that. But
right.
You know why I didn't expect that is because I assumed that, given the amount of information that was available publicly about this being organized, and the level of discourse, like what people were saying online, and some of the other things we've seen in the past happening this year, we've had people killed, that I assumed that the state would take proper precautions to make sure that important spaces like the U.S. Capitol were protected. Right. I honestly thought that there would be, a major police presence, maybe augmented with National Guard troops, to make sure that certain buildings were protected.
Sure.
And I think that this gets into something you just talked about, that it was different, but not necessarily all not done correctly, that there were good things. So like, the distinction I would draw is that in a protest environment, protecting a piece of property and keeping people from moving on a property by like holding a skirmish line and defending that skirmish line is very different than going into a space, like going into the building and forcibly removing people from that building. Once they're inside, it changes it, because it switches from you holding as an agent of the state, you holding a position to protect a piece of real estate, and only defending yourself and holding that, and preventing someone from passing, is fundamentally different than going in and physically removing someone from someplace. Not that I don't want the people removed from the Capitol, it's that the risk that it presents, the chance that someone gets hurt. It's better, I think, whenever possible, when no one is in danger, is to isolate people, back off, establish communications, let things cool down, try to talk them out of the place. So I liked I liked in many respects a softer hand once things are, not to escalate things even further if you can contain people. So there were bright spots. Sorry.
Sure. Well, and I think that to that point is that, if we're, Monday morning quarterbacking this, is that this is two plays, right? Is that this was one was the preparation and the response of to intelligence they should have had, and I can't dream that they didn't have it. But I think this kind of bleeds into we'll talk about more later, but about their own biases and quasi support for
and
this
some
action.
Overt support.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for sure. But then the next play is once the breach occurred, right? So if we break it down there, and I'm with you of where I think that how they handled it once they got inside was probably the best case scenario, and by the time it had spun out of control. Now we do see, right, to your original question, we do see that that was a very drastically different response to situations that had gotten out of control, like in spots in Portland over the summer. I guess a couple of other cities. But if we go back to the initial, right, to the first play of which I think probably more of an offensive posture would have been justifiable. Now, I don't think that I think they have to be guardians of the First Amendment. They have to that I think that law enforcement fails at very often. Is give people the space, even when it's uncomfortable, to protest. But once things started going south, is that it was shocking to me that there was no show of force. We've seen clips of like them opening the gate, but I'm going to even set that aside, right? Because that in my view could have been very anecdotal, right? Just a couple of officers that happened to be on that portion of the perimeter. But like when you see, and we've seen it since, right, even in New York, of where we see officers en masse just marching towards. They're before even anything happened, they're taking this
which is in of itself a show. It's a use of force. You're demonstrating to the you're using the physical bodies of the police and their equipment and their markings to signify to people you need to move.
That's right.
And we didn't see that. And that's where I would have liked to have seen it. Even before the crowd becomes violent, right, and tries to breach the line or pushes up and gets through or is let through, however, whatever the situation was at any given point, is that by recognizing the threat ahead of time and having a show of force to let people know they're not going to be able to get in, is the time. If you're going to use force earlier on in the encounter, and I shouldn't say use force. I'm saying use a display of authority to compel someone's behavior to prevent things from moving forward. If you're going to do that, if you've decided that I'm going to use a display of force, make sure that display of force or capacity for force is that it corresponds with the threat that's present. Right. Because if that crowd had wanted to advance on the Capitol and they encountered a force that they knew they weren't going to be able to get through,
that's right.
I'm sure that a lot of people would have reconsidered. But when they see that there's an adequate, police presence there, it emboldens them.
Well, and not only just the absence of police presence, but really of other security measures altogether, right? Yeah, the barriers that were knee high, and then again, I'd rather us focus on this as an individual event, but you can't help but go back and say, okay, what was being done, during the protests of George Floyd, and shockingly, not shockingly, is that there was no incident for which they were like, oh, well, we didn't see that coming. Right. In fact, I would argue that that a lot of the police presence made things worse during the George Floyd incidents. That they used show of force at times when they shouldn't have. That escalated the situation. One question that I have, though, is that, well, is there an estimate on the number of people that were there that day on the Capitol?
I've seen a variety of estimates. I wouldn't want to throw anything out into the ether.
So is it possible? And I ask this genuinely because I don't know the answer. Is it possible of not holding all of these people up? That notwithstanding the deaths, of course. I mean, but is it possible that was the best outcome, is for them to breach the perimeter, or is that? Do you think that was just an irresponsibility that should have never happened at all?
Well, I think it depends. It depends on
if it's strategic.
It depends. So, like, if you're a person on the ground and you're in charge, and you're like in a position where if we confront this crowd, my people are going to get hurt.
Right.
And you could evacuate the building and keep the civilians inside from being hurt. So like the law legislators and their staff, right, and the people that work there, you have an obligation to protect them.
That's right.
But if you could evacuate the building and you didn't feel as though you had adequate resources to hold a line, or you realized, hey, we're going to have to really do damage, we'd rather give up the building. I think there could be space to make that equation. Absolutely. But I do think that when you are a representative of the state and you have people behind you who are dependent upon you for their safety and security.
That's right.
That there's a requirement that you be willing to, and I think this is something that most police officers recognize and accept, is that you need to be willing to put your own interest to some degree below that of the person behind you.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that's what you've signed up to do. Right. I mean,
right. Which I think people,
that's your gig.
We forget, but I think that that's something that, that most police officers, are willing to do.
Absolutely.
But I think that, if possible, that property can always be replaced, but human lives can't.
Well, and I think that's a really, really valid point. And I think that I wish that were it applied, as well, over the summer, right?
Absolutely. But I think maybe we don't want to necessarily have the response in DC be more like the response in the summer.
Right.
All necessarily. In some cases, maybe we do.
Right.
Right. Like there's like having more officers present, barriers, preparing, maybe being a little over prepared given the consequential nature of what's happening.
Sure.
Like what's more important than this national election and our democracy. Like it's kind of an important place.
That's right.
So I think it's a balancing act that needs to take place, but I don't necessarily. I think maybe we could learn something from some of the things that the officers did. Like did you see the officer backing down the hallway?
Yeah.
Luring people away and using time and distance.
That's right.
Instead of just cranking off rounds or whatever.
So let's take that, but even go back just a step further. Is that why do you think that it is that number one is that the administration claims that this was an intelligence failure, and why do you think that officers, even once the event happens, so if we set that aside, is that there was a clear difference in response, and I'd like to separate it just a little bit because of the recognition that some of this is because there were people who were just supporters of this and were frankly complicit But I want to set those folks aside and just say the apparatus as a whole. Why do you think that, they got caught with their pants down? And was it willful?
Well, I don't think so. And this is just me, this is me thinking, so I don't know. But based on my, what I've watched unfold over the last year, especially, is that police are viewed the protest movement in the summer as being overtly directed against them, which in many respects it was.
Yeah.
Where they viewed, and through that process and through the rhetoric that was being used by Republicans and the president and by police leadership around the country, was this tying of policing even tighter, making it more tightly coupled with the conservative. I shouldn't use conservative, with right-wing politics in this country, because there's nothing conservative. Conservative means that you recognize the value in something and you want to preserve it so that, because there are lessons and things that were learned, and
that's right.
There is a revolutionary sort of right-wing nationalism that is taking over the United States, and I think that police officers, and understandably in many respects, when you turn on, if you're a police officer and you're paying attention to these things, you see one side as your people who are opposed to you, and who hate you. And then you see this other side as, well, that means, it's everything we do in our society. We try to make it like this dichotomous thing, it's one side or the other. And policing has always been affiliated with conservatives, more right-leaning people. I mean, it's a black and white way of thinking. But I think this really ratcheted that up to a dangerous level where I worry about the political ideologies of American police officers being detached from mainstream America at some point.
Yeah. And this is something that, 20 years ago, the FBI put out one of their first, I'm sure they wrote about this, even further back, but in most recent times, about the infiltration of white supremacy and inside of law enforcement. And I think that the other issue is that we don't talk about how insidious that is, of how what the influence of some of these radical folks and how they how they can recruit, because this isn't as much anymore about wearing a hood, right? Wearing, the white Klan garb. There is still some of that, and Proud Boys wearing, insignias and that sort of stuff. I just read of a police chief. I don't remember where it was, but he and one of his officers were fired after a body cam had captured them having a conversation about how slavery wasn't so bad. They were given food and shelter, and and not to fall too down a part of the rabbit hole, but I also, I think it's also, relative to the organization for which you and I, advocate for, is that this is, this is also the educational expectations that we have of police officers. It isn't to say that intelligent people can't be white supremacists. We know that, Ted Cruz, someone who is, a very intelligent man relative to academics. He's argued before the Supreme Court.
Yeah, he's a smart guy. He knows how to synthesize information and put together an argument. He's a smart guy.
Yeah, but he's also a white supremacist, and a bigot. And so it isn't to say that education is the only solution out of this. But one of the things that really hit me, I anticipated that, some of the bigger unions would be silent on this, or would be I don't want to say complicit, but they would make excuses for why it was, or try to do isolating to say that this wasn't a bigger issue. But what really hit me was this just total absence of response, really across the board from law enforcement, from a messaging standpoint. Is that I think Chief Michael Moore here, put out a statement or something that says we condemn all acts, blah blah blah. But then turned around and found employees who were there. I don't know if they were a part of the insurrection.
But I think there's a couple of people have been. I know at least one has been fired. So I don't know the details, but I'm assuming it wouldn't be just. I heard there was a protest and I was off duty and I wanted to go. So that there's a line, right? So like if some police officer thinks, for whatever reason outside of their job that, there were shenanigans with voting machine, whatever, and they want to go and voice their opinions about it publicly when they're not in uniform and they're off duty on their own time. I mean, you can't. I
think that should be protected.
Yeah, it's protected. You need to have outlet for speech, or it's driven underground. We live in we want at least I think we're going to have police officers for the foreseeable future. I want them to be citizens who are similar to us in terms of the way they view the world, and who have the same rights and freedoms and beliefs about the way we should be living together. I don't want to make it, so I'm assuming that if someone were fired, that would mean that they had to have engaged in some sort of overt activity to support something that was illegal, borderline.
But did you hear really, this kind of collective outcry from police leaders about this happening at all, and especially, the portions for which there was a clear complicity, or if not complicity, a negligence that the police had a role in this. I didn't hear anything, and one of them was most remarkable. Yeah, is that there's publications. Law Enforcement Today, I think is one of them. Police One, they have a really, really large reach.
Absolutely.
Some of those, have never seen a black person that they didn't love. They didn't love to know that they were arrested, right? I mean, it's just you can see their biases or racism in their publications or on their websites, and we know that this is a problem as well. But
I noticed the overt political sort of statements being made in those publications this last year, where it was very clear, against this particular, which again. I could kind of understand if they're following the market and they're marketing to police officers.
That's right.
But I also think it feeds on itself if you're immersed in media, and as a police officer, and the media you're reading is demonizing one side and aligning. That's part of the problem as well.
Well, one of the things that, this goes into a whole big discussion about our media in the U.S., but The Daily Show put a supercut together of Fox News right after that. And it was just one after another, the elections being stolen, the new administration is illegitimate. Lots of talk of we can't take this, lying down, and we've got to stand up and fight. And I remember watching, it was like a 3 or 4 minute cut. And I was like, well, no shit, people have responded the way they have, because if that is their primary source of media, this is just being beat over and over and over and over. And so I mentioned the media in a grander scale about their irresponsibility in promoting a lot of this stuff. And while Fox News is easy to pick, is that we have a problem. We have a problem at CNN. We have a problem at MSNBC, about them driving political ideology instead of news anyway. But when I saw that that even these law enforcement publications, which I would say some are more reputable than others, but still just silence. And I was like, wow, even those who that there could be an argument that they are the cooler heads or they're the more reasonable folks. Not so much. And that's what concerns me. Now, I think the point that you made about how this isn't directed at them is a very fair point. And I think that could explain some of this difference. But I had at least, I guess, naively thought that there would, again, parts of the unions or whatever that, who were defending, Derek Chauvin. I didn't expect them to be saying anything or, who had been standing at these same kind of rallies. But I did think that, that there would have been a chorus of responsible, police officers or police administrators that would be calling this out, and they haven't. And that's what really concerns me about how entrenched is all of this.
Well, I think it's entrenched, and I think this has been monetized. So the way we distribute information across the internet, everything is all about capturing, people's attention so you can sell advertising, that's what it's all about, attention and collecting information. And the people that are creating those systems have come to recognize, and the systems themselves have come to recognize, that political division and pushing things out onto the extremes brings attention and viewership. And so I don't think it's necessarily that it's the people who run these like law enforcement today or whatever, that they're the problem. I think it's that the system is such that they need to hire somebody who will do that to maximize.
They're just feeding profits into the problem.
Right. And but I don't think it's that we can change the hearts and minds of the people at those news publications.
Right.
I think it's that the system itself has been designed to divide us, to make money off of doing that. So the people they hire are going to be hired because they're the people that are going to it's not that they're deciding to do it or getting drawn into it. I think it's like it's become like a revolutionary force. Like we've changed the way that we communicate in a fundamental way. Like it's like the printing press kind of changed the internet. And now we've mixed that with capitalism and thrown our politics and monetized it. And it's a revolutionary force. So I think it's really dangerous.
And I don't disagree, but I don't disagree with the problem that we have overall. And I think everything that you said is true. I would push back a little bit to say that are these publications, are they or are they not representative of the institution of policing? Maybe not every single officer. I mean, there were some officers who did some interviews, and the one guy said, "Thank you for helping me, but fuck you for being there," which I applauded that he said. But when so if we're able to divide this over to the media, then I agree with your sentiment, is that we can say that, well, this is really just the media apparatus at work that is really about sensationalism and clicks and those kinds of things. But I kind of think that that this is pointing directly to the culture of policing as well, for which this is very acceptable.
Absolutely, I think so. I hate the idea of militarization or like militarizing the police like we talked earlier about white nationalists and racist organizations trying to recruit police officers. I think that, like we also said earlier, that it's a right-leaning institution, and it always has been.
Right.
And if you look at the history of policing, it was designed by people who've been engaging in war. Soldiers and military men who were creating an institution that was different but basically the same, to carry out the same function, but in a domestic setting. And it was also an apparatus used to control populations based on their class and their race, catching slaves, breaking up labor strikes. So so it's not as if this is some new phenomena that's being generated by the media. But I do think that over time, over the past few decades, that we have seen a professionalization and improve. Like if you had to deal with a cop in the 1970s compared to like a cop in the 80s, then the 90s and the 2000s, 2010s, it's going to be problematic no matter where you go. But the further along you go in history, the more controls there are, the more cameras there are, the more, it's not perfect. It's terrible, but there is a steady, there is an improvement, not as fast as it needs to be.
That's right.
But I think that these media forces and this polarization has the potential to halt that progress.
Yes.
And perhaps reverse it. And it may have already, I don't know.
Well,
you're drawing in, and think about the other thing about this is like, you're not only messaging so you're not only isolating officers in these bubbles and bombarding them with these messages, but you're also limiting the types of people that are going to be drawn to the profession. So you're I just don't picture a lot of young people right now in college saying, I really want to make a change. And because there's a lot of people who try to enter policing with that idea. They think, I'd like to, these starry-eyed people, you need those people because the institution is designed. I'm sorry to talk so much, but I had a guy say something fascinating the other day. He said that the police go out and they try to find these people that haven't been arrested for this or that and pass this test, and they meet these qualifications, and then knowing that they're going to then take them and try to destroy them for 20 years. That's
a really good point.
This was a cop who said this to me, like somebody who's still on the job. And so like, you need to have people, if you want like academic institutions to have access and research partners, and if you want these departments to be responsive to civilian governance, then you need to draw in forward-thinking people. And I just don't know how they're going to do that now.
I don't either. And in fact, it reminds. I have a neighbor actually whose husband had a lifelong dream of being a cop, and when she shared a story with me that not long after they began dating, he was like he was a tattoo artist now, but he wanted to be a police officer. And she was like, both of them very forward thinking folks. And she was like, what the fuck are you talking about? And he's like, no, we still make a difference, blah, blah, blah. And he went through the testing and got pretty far along in the selection process. He may have been given an offer, and they had a family night gathering, like cops do, especially very early on, make sure the family's on board with what you're about to do. And she said that both of them sat there in awe about the culture and how detached it was from their own ways of thinking. And he was like, no way, absolutely no way. And then, the other points of evidence as well is that, I'll go further away than either, you and I, so, we're not personalizing this, but when you look online, at whistleblowers or officers, who are, who speak heavily, about the flaws of the system, that they're not active. Their ex are retired at best, right? LEAP, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which I'm supportive of, a member. I don't know if they have active duty officers. I certainly don't think they had it when their primary function was advocating against the war on drugs. And so this is what I think, just in totality is that we're lacking is that if there is representation of people who are saying, we see the problem, we see that this is unfair. And you and I both talk to officers, so we know that they're there, right?
Yeah, I think they're very few and far between.
Yeah. They're under threat in some ways of
it could be overt threat. It could be an overt threat, or I think more likely, I know for me, would have been that I am immersed in this culture that like all my friends, all my family hang out, we barbecue together.
That's right.
We go to the lake together, go camping together, watch each other's kids.
Yeah.
We share this experience together, so you'd be turning against your community.
That's right.
I mean, it becomes think like my wife's doing some research right now on like minors and learning about minors. And I see like these similarities where you give people this role where they're engaging in this activity, this, that's can be exciting at times and dangerous at times, or even if it's an overly enhanced fear of violence or whatever, but it's there.
Yep.
You have the shared identity that you believe other people can't understand unless they're part of it. You build these insulated communities, and the fear of leaving. I had another officer tell me this recently, that he was getting ready to leave, and one of the biggest obstacles was like, well, then I'm no longer a cop. Once I'm done, like it had become such a deep part
of your identity.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you are, and when something is that much of a part of your identity, being publicly critical of it is being critical of yourself almost.
I had a student ask me the other day, what was the thing about policing that I liked the most? And I said the camaraderie. Now, as I grew and my own ideology changed. I mean, I was always on the left side of things, even in the very beginning, but certainly not where I am today. So some of that drifted apart, but I miss the idea of it because, and I see it with my partner, her job, working in policing still, of just how close knit it is. Now, I think that can be problematic, and I think that that's leading to some issues, but
it's also going to be very fulfilling.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're humans who are designed to be attracted to tribes, and
absolutely.
What a more, exclusive tribe than that is that someone who's been built up to be told that they are the guardians of society, that they are, the fabric that's keeping things together. And how brave, just showing up to work is an act of heroism. Which kind of leads me to, which I think, many of these things, are part of the problem, right? Is that, we over fetishize policing in our culture, so Law and Order and CSI, how many different shows they have now. We have 911, I think, is now starting to branch out into different cities. So there's, it's not just the one show. It's now 911 Austin or Houston or something. And then before the summer's over, there's going to be 5 more cities. So I think that's part of the problem is that just how, we look at the police and what pedestal we've placed them on. But when we talk about reform, and I think that's been an obstacle reform, right? Because, it's kind of like, especially during the Iraq War or, going back to the Vietnam War, is if you critique the war, then you're critiquing the heroism of the individuals. And, and then, you're smacked down pretty hard. Do you think that that if we combine what happened with George Floyd, which I think, propelled us in to areas of reform that our country's probably never seen relative to law enforcement, do you think what happened on the 6th has pushed us back or pushed us further? Because now, just like what we talked about very early, is that now there's talk about domestic terrorism laws. We now know that the fencing that was placed, this 12-foot fencing around the Capitol, is now going to be permanent. Has this helped the cause or hurt the cause? What do you think?
I don't know. So look, at face value, you're like, well, it's undermined this movement because it's made transparent to the American people that it's a dangerous, radical, movement of people that breach the Capitol, delegitimizes this idea that they were the law and order party and group, and that that the police were aligning with. It undermines that narrative. But then at the same time, when you look at the numbers of people that still are like, because I can't help but just link this to the president. I mean, I just see this as being part of this like neo-fascist movement, I guess I might call it, like this, right-wing ultra nationalism, America first.
That so many unions, by the way, endorsed, for which they had never endorsed police before, presidents before.
Right.
But go ahead. Sorry.
Right. I mean, so you have this movement, and I would think, okay, well, it's been undermined. But then at the same time, I look and I see that this happened, like this really happened, and it still has this much support. Right. I don't have any confidence that there are going to be any consequences for Donald Trump.
I don't either.
I don't think, and I could totally see him or someone very similar to him. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone similar to him, but this movement is going to be here in 2022 and 2024. And I don't have a hell of a lot of faith that the other side is right now in a position where they're going to do anything substantive to take away from that base, to change the narrative in any way. So I think for the foreseeable future, we're going to have a major chunk of the American public and our security forces, a big chunk of the working rank and file members of our security forces, who view that movement as theirs.
Well, but I think of it kind of this way. Let me come at this in a different angle. Is that I think that there came a point with George Floyd where the general public started saying, okay, things aren't right with policing, right? We're over-policed. Their budgets are way too inflated, and people got behind not so much directly the terminology of defund the police, but the notion behind is that we can't just allow the police to continue to be the priority of everything. And politicians have used law and order as a scare tactic for decades upon decades, and slowly, we see it with George Gascon or Larry Krasner, that there's some pull away from that that isn't necessarily as politically expedient as it once was, but fear. I think it was Jefferson. It might have been Adams said, those who will trade liberty for safety deserves neither. But it is exactly what we've done, and that's worked. That's built up this enormous law enforcement apparatus, kind of like what we saw after 9/11 with the huge expansion between federal law enforcement and fusion centers and these anti-terrorism units locally. My question is that do you think that the general public is going to look at kind of like what happened on the 6th and the realities that this stuff isn't going away? I agree with you. I think we're going to see more of it. That's going to cause them to withdraw the support for reducing law enforcement footprint, or is this now well, if it could happen there, it could happen here, even though it probably wouldn't?
So I don't know if it's necessarily going to be the idea that someone's going to storm the Capitol and that's why we should fund law enforcement type of thing. But I think what I do anticipate happening is I think you're right that there was a mobilization of a big chunk of the public to recognize that there needed to be a better attempt to use resources to address the underlying reasons for the problems that our society has, rather than just funding police to deal with everything.
That's right.
So like we have a broken mental health care system. We have, poverty. Yeah, we have abject poverty and people who are disconnected from society and have been abandoned, in cities across the country and in rural communities across the country. And that's the reason we have crime. Like that's why we have people kill each other. That's why we have people shoot each other. That's why we have people dying of overdoses and getting in gunfights with the police. And like a lot of these things that are happening is because of these underlying problems.
That's right.
So I think people recognized that we need to refocus our attention and address those issues. But when they do that, and then there's not a follow-up by the state to address those issues in a substantive way, then the problems are going to be exacerbated. I mean, they're just going to still be there.
Yeah.
And people are not like, you can't move away from policing by just getting rid of the police.
That's right.
You need to say, well, what are the problems that we've created police to address? What are other ways of addressing them? And then having an intergenerational project where you try to, eliminate a big chunk of people that are in poverty.
I wish I remember the city, and maybe you do, that was in the news this past week, because I really would love to applaud them. Maybe we can link a story to it below. But there was a city this year that took $1 million or so out of the police budget, and they bought hotel space, or an old abandoned hotel or something.
Which it was, but I read about that too. I can't remember what city it was. And Baltimore? No, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember where it was, but someone artfully said, like, this is the defund movement. This is what we're talking about, right? Is that we're shifting resources. So you don't really think that this event in of itself is really going to change anything about the movement, or
it could. I don't. I just don't know. I think it's too early on to know what that's going to look like. So I'm sure it'll have an influence, but I don't know how people are going to, because it's so fresh. I don't know. And I think like the defund, like reallocating police resources to do those types of things at the city levels is important, and that's a part of it. But I think in order for this to be successful and to really use the momentum that was created last summer, it needs to be like a national project, like New Deal type of. I mean, we've had 2 financial crises. We've had 20 years.
Coming up on our third, probably.
Yeah, we've had this global pandemic, political unrest. We're in a crisis. Yeah. And when you're in a crisis, you don't just we need to catch up from the things that we haven't been doing for the last 40 years.
That's right.
And create an environment where people can thrive, and they're not. I mean, life expectancy, I think, has gone down again this year. Yeah. People don't have any hope. Like, kids don't have a lot of hope for the future. Like, it's a very pessimistic time. And I don't think that just individual departments doing things is enough. I think this is not going to work unless there's a political movement. And I just don't think we're in a position to do that right now. So I'm a little pessimistic.
Yeah. And I'm kind of with you. And is that when we look at kind of the avalanche of problems that we're facing right now, I mean, from poverty, I think, I teach, a section of criminology in the criminal justice course that, we talk about, education, poverty, and mental health, right? Those are generally the primary predictors of crime. And so I'm glad that our youth in this country, are very, very in tune, with the neglect that we've had around these areas. But I think, to your point, simultaneously is that the whole place is on fire, and
everyone knows it. Both sides, everyone, right? Yep. Even police officers. I mean, I think in my experience, the police officers I still talk to, that if you say, we need to start help, we need to have a system in place to deal with people with mental illness.
That's right.
They would be like, for sure. That's most of my job, is dealing with people who are off their meds, or don't have meds, or smoking meth to treat their depression, or
That's right.
That we need less. If people were less poor and had better jobs and had better schools, and had cleaner streets and had recreation facilities and all these things, would your job be easier? Well, hell yeah, So Well, I just worry we're missing that opportunity.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that some of this is the responsibility of policymakers in the police administrations, right?
Yes.
I'm glad here in LA, at least, is that the council just along with the police department just approved a civilian response team to some non-emergency crimes. I don't know why we're not using technology for, any nonviolent or any crimes, that aren't in progress. I mean, you should be able to go to any website and be able to fill out a police report on your own. Why that requires an armed officer. But simultaneously is that we still see this overemphasis in policing of poor people. We see this emphasis in policing. There was another deadly use of force case that was similar to the one here in LA County, where the initial interaction was because of a bicycle violation. Mm-hmm. And to me, this is just, where the priorities of the police are just still so entrenched. And I agree with you. I think when you get down to the individual officer level, is that they don't want to be fucking with, somebody because they're standing on the freeway, exit ramp with a sign in their hand, or some guy arguing with a tree or whatever. They recognize that this is a bigger issue that society has to take care of. But
it's the system has been created. Like, all of us are being controlled by this system in one way or another. Right. It's just the tools that are used on different people. If you're a rich white kid whose mom and dad are both attorneys and went to Harvard and Yale, then the institution that's going to socialize you and control you is going to be Harvard and Yale, and
that's right,
the law firm and those opportunities. If you're a middle class person, it may be that whatever job or the military or whatever other institution that shapes and controls you and, turns you into what's considered a productive member of society. And we have just made a decision over a long period of time that we're willing to abandon in a huge segment of our society and just manage them as an underclass. And the way we do that is by recruiting working class and middle class men and women to go in with guns and make sure they don't get out of control.
Yeah.
There are other ways to control people.
That for sure. But I heard a interview on NPR over the summer talking about the history of policing and about how by design is that we are very often using people who, some departments, pay fairly decent, right? For sure. But I mean, when we talk about 18,000 police departments in the country, half of them are 10 people or less. These are people who aren't working too far above minimum wage, very frankly. Right. And so, but it gives, and then we put them in a nice uniform. We give them the prestige. We give them, a gun and a mission. Or a message that says that, that they are up on this pedestal. But who they're really enforcing are really, it's their neighbors, right? Or maybe just one street up, right? And this has been done really since, the early days of Berkeley PD, who quote unquote professionalized policing, in the 40s and early 50s. So I guess for me, the big question always is about these things is what's our way out? As an advocate, I would say, I believe in the cause that we're fighting for. Of course, I think there's some huge issues, structural issues that I don't know if we're going to be tackled in my lifetime. But I also believe in harm reduction, right? Even if I believed in the idea of abolishing police, which in theory I think is great, but
that should be the goal.
Right?
Have you ever read a piece of utopian style science fiction about a society in the future that has like a major police force out on the streets, stopping people? That's the dystopic version of the future.
Yeah, that's right.
The future is where people are, behaving the way they're behaving because they want to do right by the people around them and
Sure.
be loved and respected and those types of things. So I think that's the future. But like you say, what is the future? I think it's like, what do we need to work on? Like, what's the optimistic sort of, what do we do next to address this?
And what do we do in the meantime? Right. I
well,
mean, even if I were to say, that I'm a proponent of the police abolishment, I mean, we still have people murdering each other. We still have people being sexually assaulted. We still have, people who are, getting guns pointed to their face, at the 7-Eleven. And so I believe in that part of the advocacy is that we strengthen those things that we know that we need, right? We want the police to be there to either solve these kinds of crimes or find ways for which that they can participate in the reduction of these crimes. I don't think policing in its current form is crime preventers in any stretch.
There's better ways to do that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. But I do believe in kind of harm reduction. But even I guess is really what my long-winded question is that even attainable in a realistic sense, or does this just move so slowly that
I think it moves slowly. So I think it's that we need to recognize that it's going to move slowly, but that it is attainable. Like 100 years from now, I could see a very different world. Like that seems possible to me. So I think it's about recognizing that we may not see massive drastic improvements, but the only way we're going to see massive drastic improvements is probably over a long period of time. And if we don't do our part to do that now, then our kids and our grandkids are going to have to do all of that work eventually. So, and then the people that are dealing with it on a daily basis right now, like there are things that can be done to change policies, improve training, reallocate resources, things that are not necessarily getting at the root problem, but that are maybe somewhat superficial, but to the person or the family who's impacted by those events, it means a hell of a lot to them.
That's right.
I think I'm sure everyone's heard the story of the guy walking down the beach and he sees a guy throwing starfish into the water, and there's like thousands of starfish on the beach. So the guy's walking down the beach and he sees this guy and he's throwing starfish, and there's thousands of these starfish. And he walks over and he says, "Well, why are you bothering? There's like 10,000 of these starfish. Most of them are just going to dry out in the sun anyway. The tide's going down. Why are you bothering? It doesn't mean anything." And he says, "Well, it means a hell of a lot to this one." And he throws it back into the water.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
I think that's the approach that you have to take, but you can't, so I think it's twofold. It's working on harm reduction, but then also advocating for the big change, for the New Deal, for the big shift, because it's going to take a big shift.
Right. Well, and why do you think that this is just going to be the political cycling out of the old guard in with the new? Because we see, people like Congressman Rowe from out here, or AOC, or other members of the squad, quote unquote. I mean, none of these are senators, but so there's a limit to their power, of course. But I mean, do you think that some of this is just cycling of the old guard? I guess I
think so.
Yeah, but we don't see that cycling out in police departments as much. Right. I mean, because it just doesn't seem to be an environment that's very conducive for there to be an AOC. Right.
No. But I think that younger officers, look, when I was on, I found that the old school guys who'd been there for 20 years, they had very different attitudes.
Right. They were pissed off that you just still couldn't club people in the face.
Yeah. And then I had younger officers that were like, I had gay officers that were married.
Right.
And they were working alongside guys who remembered when you arrested people for having gay sex.
Sure.
Sure.
Well, and I maybe I guess I'm in a cynical mood today.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Because I guess we did see some positive change. Hamilton County, Ohio, it's the greater Cincinnati area, elected openly gay sheriff, and she is a proponent, for change. Charleston, South Carolina, and I named both of these places because they're both places for which the area I worked. But Charleston County unseated Sheriff Cannon, who had been there, since the beginning of time, and everyone really kind of thought that he would die sitting in his desk, and so he was unseated by a more progressive sheriff. I think for me probably is the pace for which becomes frustrating. And I always talk about that. One of the and I'm sure this is about societies, and that isn't exclusive to the U.S. But something that I think that we're really, really good at is knowing a solution to a problem and then not doing it. And that just, I want to jab myself with a pencil because of it, because I don't get it, right? I mean, as if we know that poverty in education is going to, the lack of it is going to be a big driver to crime. Not including all of the, healthcare issues and financial strain that it has on taxpayers. It's more expensive. And then we go like, well, okay, well, let's not do anything about it. Right. It drives me batshit crazy. I don't know why.
I think it's because, it's the system was designed by a handful of elite white guys
for sure.
The 18th century. And It was designed with the worry that we don't want to give the mob too much power.
Yeah.
We want to make things difficult and complicated so that there's these checks, and it's difficult to change things because we want to protect our interests. Because they were worried about they're worried about the French Revolution. They were. It was a very different world, and then now we're in a completely different period of history where we fundamentally change the way we communicate. And there's all this technological change and this global community, and the system is it's 200 something years old. So
well, and we have people who profit heavily on the status quo as well, right? Is that
the ancestors of those people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. There's a great documentary if you haven't seen it, called The House I Live In, that looks at some of the really
movement? What was it?
The House I Live In.
Okay.
And he explores the drug war and the obstacles. First, the recognition of what an abysmal failure it's been, but when you really start kind of digging behind the curtain to see who's profiting from the drug war, and it's just so many just kind of passive things that then become obstacles for change. Right? Is that if you're talking about mass incarceration reduction, not only are we talking about prison systems being an enormous job program, but think about the gas station that's on the way, right, on the state route, on the way to the prison, or the little diner that, the vast majority of its business. So then all of a sudden when we're talking, and then that doesn't even include, the slave labor inside of prisons or the suppliers of soap or sheets.
The schools nearby for the prison staff, and the hospitals and all that
exactly.
Stuff.
Right. We built an enormous economy around it. And I know this has gone so far outside of talking about the insurrection in some ways, but this is really about reflection about how do we change, and what do we do, because there needs to be some major shifts, and and with that comes some big obstacles, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that it does tie in. It's the same root causes of homicides and that we're experiencing. Those are the same things that created the political environment where a movement like this could flourish. Look at the 1930s. You had a global fascist movements moving around the world.
That's
right. It was the Depression, and now you have the 2008 financial crisis. You have deindustrialization. You have coronavirus. You have another depression.
And record income inequality.
And record income inequality.
Right, and I've read that's the number one predictor of a societal collapse. This is, we're seeing this stuff that's happening with Reddit. hold the line,
right?
Yeah. Don't sell. But this is all a response to this, right? Is that, I mean, and I guess kind of this was the big, maybe we can wrap up with this, is really kind of reflecting about
we're up over our hour here. The time goes by so fast.
It does. Right, but it's about Trump's influence that he had in his movement, had on law enforcement. Was it? Do you think that it was back to your original point of where this was a side for which maybe they didn't believe in all of his ideology? I don't know, but it was a side for which was loudly proclaiming we're on your side. Or do you think they are just more aligned ideologically, with these kinds of existing power structures?
It's probably a combination of all those things. I mean, the keys, the macho. I don't understand alpha why male. He's viewed as the macho alpha man. I don't get it. But apparently, a lot of people look at it. Apparently, some women, there's certain women find him sexy too. I don't. And men, I'm sure, but it's crazy to me. But I think it's
that gives me hope.
I feel makes me feel
I'll have a fan base.
But I think it's that they're more closely aligned with the existing those existing power structures, that movement that he co-opted. But it's also, I think, this angst that we've all felt that something is wrong.
Yeah.
And that this guy is like gonna upset that right. He's just standing up for this nostalgic sort of view, and doing it in a way that's different than these people that have become so discredited. I really just, I can't help but blame policymakers and the political class in this country for allowing this to happen.
I agreed. Well, hey, before we wrap up, Tom, I want to just shift gears just real quick and take a moment to plug the Institute is going to be hosting a really remarkable webinar that's coming up February 17th. We're going to be discussing implicit bias, and we have it's free. It's going to be just an hour long, Wednesday, February 17th, from 11 to 12 Pacific time. And we have some great academics that's going to be on this panel, starting with Dr. Maria Haberfeld from John Jay, Dr. Lewis James from Washington State University, Dr. Ajima Olagir from Temple University, and Mr. Connor Powelson, who's a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Maryland. And so if you go to our website, trainingreform.org, you'll see on the top banner a link to register for this event. I think it's going to be an amazing conversation about the efficacy of implicit bias training, and how much that can change policy, kind of in the light of what we've been talking about in this session.
Sounds good. Thanks for hanging out today. And I'll put a link to the website, so you can, and just it'll be on the banner up at the very top.
Yep, it's at the very top.
You can join. That's February 17th. And what time was it again?
From 11 to 12 Pacific time.
11 to 12 Pacific. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. And everyone, if you want to support the broadcast, the best thing to do is follow, subscribe, whatever platform you're on, share this on your social media, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.